You can go on any date and there's a good chance you'll walk away with a story about how odd the other person was. For some reason, that chance multiplies by 10 when it's a Tinder date. Do you have such weird Tinder horror story? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I went on a Tinder date with a guy who claimed to be a famous chef. He took me to a dive bar, which was fine, but the evening quickly went downhill. He started bragging nonstop about his supposed fame. We had some drinks and watched sports, and at one point he said, "You're cute," which was nice enough, until he followed it up with, "I'm going to make you bleed." Things got even weirder when he invited one of his friends to join us. I was feeling uneasy, but I stayed. At some point, we stepped outside and he leaned in for a kiss. I was drunk, so I kissed him back, even though the vibe was already off. Then, out of nowhere, he started telling me about how he was being charged with battering his ex-girlfriend, but he totally didn't do it. When it came time to pay the bill, he conveniently lost his wallet, leaving me to cover everything. He promised to pay me back, but, surprise, I never saw a dime. As if that wasn't bad enough, while we were standing outside, he leaned against me. At first, I thought he was going in for another kiss, but then I looked down and realized he was peeing on me, right there, in the street. I was mortified. Too drunk to drive home, I immediately found a nearby hotel, booked a room, and took the hottest shower of my life. Lesson learned. Never again. Story 2. A few years ago, I matched with a cute girl and we decided to meet up for drink. Everything was going well, so we decided to head to the beach with a six-pack to stargaze and maybe kiss. Somehow, we ended up on a stolen sailboat at 2 a.m. with her ex, an old, drunk boat repairman who had made copies of the keys to steal the boat, and her dog. After about 30 minutes of arguing with her ex, she passed out. Her dog was terrified and started making a mess everywhere. Meanwhile, her ex started tripping on acid and yelled at me to take care of her, and never heard her before running to the bow of the boat. The old, drunk boat repairman just sat there, chugging vodka. I decided to clean up after the dog, bring the poor pup inside the cabin with me, and passed out. The next morning, I woke up to her and her ex screaming at each other about a car crash. The old boat thief was gone, and I had no idea where I had parked my car. I slipped out unnoticed, grabbed some coffee and breakfast, and wandered around the harbor until I found my car. I never spoke to her again, but I didn't delete Tinder. Edit. The ex and the old drunk boat thief are two different people. As for how we ended up on the boat, she got a call from her ex, and I didn't realize he was her ex until we were already out on the water. She asked if I wanted to go sailing with some friends, and being drunk and a fan of sailing, I said sure. Story 3. A little backstory. A few years ago, I was dating this girl whose father really didn't like me. It was unusual because most parents either genuinely like me or are at least polite about it. But this guy? He was consistently difficult, and I wasn't afraid to call him out when necessary. Anyway, her parents eventually divorced, and she and I broke up a few months later. Fast forward about a year. I had been dating a girl I met on Tinder for a few months and things were starting to get serious. We reached the stage where she wanted me to meet her family. Her mom, stepdad, and little sister. I was completely fine with it and agreed to go. She mentioned her stepdad was especially excited to meet me since we were both Kansas City Chiefs fans. Well, imagine my shock when her stepdad turned out to be the same guy, my ex-girlfriend's dad. Small world, right? Story 4. My friend had a bit of a rough experience. He picked up a woman and took her to a motel. As they were heading into the room, she said, "Oh no, I left my purse in the car. Do you mind if I grab it?" Being polite, he said, "Sure, no problem," and handed her his keys. A few minutes later, he stepped outside to see where she was, and discovered his car was gone. Edit. To clarify, he did get his car back. The police found it about a week later, but as far as I know, she was never caught. If you're in Baltimore and meeting new people, maybe hold on to your keys just in case. Story 5. I matched with my best friend's fiance after their engagement party. I took screenshots of everything and showed them to my friend because I don't play those games. As a result, I lost my best friend and was uninvited to the wedding. The marriage lasted only 18 months. Since so many people have asked, I didn't swipe right on my own. I took a screenshot and asked my friend what she wanted me to do. She told me to swipe right to see if he was active, so I did. He messaged me asking to hook up, and I shut him down. But he kept pushing. I gave my friend all the screenshots. He then uninvited me from the wedding because he was sure I'd embarrass him, and he was right. I would never sleep with my friend's fiance, nor would I pretend he wasn't a jerk. That's why the friendship ended. She came from a culture where marriage before children was expected. She was desperate for a baby and thought he was her last chance. He was running for public office and wanted the image of a smiling wife and cute baby. Yes, they both used each other. Edit 1. Yes, they had a baby. Edit 2. No, he didn't get elected. Story 6. A friend of mine hit it off with a girl, and after a few days, she invited him to a house party. He thought, why not? Sounds fun. So, he went. When he arrived, she introduced him to a few of her friends, most of whom were guys. As the night went on, more and more guys showed up, but there weren't many women at the party. Eventually, they started chatting and realized something interesting. This girl had invited all of them from Tinder. Turns out, she wasn't planning a romantic evening. She was gathering people to help make her birthday party lively. Story 7. A few months ago, I started chatting with a guy on Tinder. He seemed nice enough, though not really my usual type. Still, we had a good conversation going for a couple of days. Looking back now, I realize I made a mistake by casually mentioning where I work. The same night I told him, I noticed someone who looked a lot like him walk past my workplace. Since we hadn't met in person yet, I couldn't be sure, so I just brushed it off. Couple of days later, I was at work, and it was a quiet day. My phone battery was low, so I told him I'd message him later when my phone died. Not 10 minutes later, he walked into my workplace holding an iPhone charger. While this could have been a thoughtful gesture under different circumstances, it felt odd, especially since we'd never actually met in person before. What made it stranger was that he had previously mentioned living on the opposite side of the city from where I worked. At that point, I was uncomfortable but didn't know how to handle it. I decided to return the charger after my shift to close the loop. He said he was at a nearby bar, so I stopped by, handed it back, and politely made an excuse to leave. Later that night, I checked his Instagram and was shocked to see he had posted a selfie with the caption, "I'm now a taken man, winky face," as if we were officially together, after seeing each other in person only once, briefly. What unsettled me even more was what happened afterward. For the next few weeks, every time I finished work, I would see him walking by on his own, right at the time my shift ended. It felt too coincidental to be unintentional, and it really creeped me out. Needless to say, I stopped all contact after that. Story 8. I showed up at the restaurant for a date and waited for about 30 minutes. Eventually, I decided to order some food for myself since it didn't seem like he was going to show. Just as I was getting ready to leave, I got a text from him. "There's a liquor store across the street from the restaurant. Can you pick me up 2 6-packs?" I politely told him I wouldn't be doing that. His response? He said he'd decided to stay home and play frisbee with his dog instead. At that point, I deleted the dating app, stopped by the liquor store for a bottle of wine, and went home to enjoy a quiet evening on my own. For the next month, he kept texting me, saying things like how he'd bought tickets to see me perform. The strange part? I'm a retired ballerina and haven't been in a show for years. Not long after, he messaged again, raving about how amazing I was on stage that night. I never responded. Honestly, dating feels way too confusing sometimes. I think I'm ready to take a break from it all. Story 9. This couldn't have come at a more fitting time. After ending a 6-year relationship, I met a guy on Tinder. He was in his final year of physical therapy school, seemed like he had his life together, and was genuinely fun to be around. I made it very clear from the start that I wasn't looking to rush into anything and wanted to take my time getting to know him. A few months later, we started dating and things were going really well. I was happy and even planned to bring him home for Christmas after we had been together for about 6 months. Then, last Monday, I received a message on Facebook from someone I didn't know. She explained that she had matched with my boyfriend on Tinder and, after finding his Facebook account, noticed that it said he was in a relationship with me. She messaged to confirm if that was true because they had plans for a date that week. Along with her message, she included screenshots of their conversations. I confronted him, and after some digging through his phone, not something I normally do, I found explicit texts between him and at least 2 other women, in addition to the Tinder match who messaged me. When I asked him why, he claimed he had been feeling insecure and unsure about whether I truly wanted to be with him, so he sought false reassurance from others. That was it for me. I ended things with him on the spot. On a brighter note, I met up with the girl who messaged me, and we ended up grabbing drinks together. We actually became friends through this whole ordeal. Edit. He was very insistent about me opening up to him and being vulnerable. Meanwhile, he was living in his parents' basement, telling women on Tinder that he was a doctor, and opening conversations with "what hurts," followed by offers for massages. The funniest part? He told one girl he loved Motion City soundtrack and had just seen them live a few weeks ago. What he conveniently forgot to mention was that I had bought the tickets and taken him to the concert. Definitely dodged a bullet. Story 10. I started talking to this really nice guy, and for about 2 weeks everything seemed to be going great. Then I started getting calls from a woman who he said was his crazy roommate. According to him, she was in love with him and constantly causing problems, including trying to get him fired from his jobs. At first, I believed him, but as things unfolded, it became clear that she wasn't the one lying. She wasn't just his roommate, she was actually his live-in girlfriend, and they had moved to this state together. To top it off, I found out he wasn't a citizen and was apparently trying to use the situation to obtain papers. It was a mess, to say the least. Thanks, Tinder, for the adventure I didn't ask for. Story 11. I matched with this guy who looked like a solid 10 in his photos. Seriously, he was gorgeous. He messaged me and asked if I wanted to meet up for coffee, and I said yes. A little while later, he messaged again, asking if I could pick him up. I figured, why not? So, I went to get him. When I picked him up, we decided to grab dinner instead of coffee. He was super funny and just as attractive as his pictures, so I was happy to keep hanging out. But then, things took a bit of an unexpected turn. During the evening, he mentioned that he has a son. He shared that the child's mother had moved to Washington but didn't say where exactly, and he hadn't seen his son in months. It was a sad story, and I felt for him. Then he pulled out his phone and asked me to look through a folder of photos and videos of his son. There were at least 300 pictures, and he wanted to share the backstory of almost every single one. I sat there for what felt like forever, trying to stay engaged and empathetic. But by the time he left, I was so relieved. The date had taken such an awkward and heavy turn, and I wasn't sure how to process it. That wasn't the end of it though. He texted me 8 or 9 times every day afterward, even though I didn't reply. Eventually, I had to block him on all social media because he just wouldn't take the hint. Looking back, I do feel bad for the guy. He clearly had a lot on his plate. But still, it wasn't the connection I was looking for. Edit, I swear, this guy really was a 10. I showed his pictures to my friends, and they all said they'd date him, even with the baggage. But for me, it just wasn't meant to be. Story 12. I needed a date to attend a Passover dinner with my friends, so I met this guy. He showed up wearing a vest and a newsboy hat, then introduced himself with a bow and a flourish of his hat. The night quickly took a turn from there. When it was time to eat, he refused to touch any of the food because things on the plate were touching, it was soup. He also wouldn't stop talking throughout the 12-minute Seder, making the whole experience pretty awkward. When it came time for him to catch his train home, he deliberately missed it so he could stay the night. I wasn't having it though. After watching a movie together, during which he maintained some uncomfortable personal space, I convinced my friend to come with me so we could drive him to the nearest train station. On the drive, he casually mentioned that he was schizophrenic but didn't take medication because it was the devil. He also tried to hold my hand, explaining that my small hands made him feel uncomfortable. The night ended with him telling me he was going to do something inappropriate on the subway and write my name in it. Needless to say, there was no second date. Story 13. This didn't happen to me, but I worked as a bartender for a while and heard a lot of wild stories secondhand. One regular came in and told me about a bad Tinder date she had. I'm not sure of all the details, but it wasn't bad enough to stop her from bringing him home afterward. The next morning, he left, and she brushed it off as just a one-night fling. A few days later, however, her debit card got declined. She was confused, especially since she's a bartender at a busy spot, is good about saving, and usually has plenty of cash. She checked her account and found several charges at Best Buy, Grubhub, and other places. She decided to check her credit card too, and found a bunch of charges for streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, and Sling. Curious, she tried to contact the guy, but he had already deleted his profile. However, she remembered they had a mutual friend on Facebook, so she reached out to try and track him down. Turns out, he'd done the exact same thing to this friend. I'm not sure how it ended, but she was definitely determined to get justice after a mediocre hookup turned into a full-blown case of identity theft. Story 14. I went on a date with a guy I didn't have much in common with, but I thought I'd give it a shot anyway. We met at a bar, and by the time I arrived, he'd already had 2 pitchers of beer but seemed totally sober, at least, that's what I could tell. We hung out, talked, and while he seemed nice enough, I just wasn't feeling it. I wanted to leave, but he convinced me to go to another bar for one more drink. It was only around 8 p.m., so I agreed to one more round. At the next bar, we sat down, and a couple next to us was making out. He looked at me and asked what I thought people would do if he and I started kissing. I could tell where this was headed, so I tried to laugh it off and joke that no one would pay attention. But he insisted we should make out. I nervously laughed and said that wasn't a good idea, then excused myself to the restroom. When I came back, He had a shot waiting for me and insisted I take it, only me, not him. I declined, and he got really upset, saying he was ready to leave. At that point, he had consumed 2 pitchers of beer, 4 margaritas, and 2 more pints, yet didn't seem drunk. Still, I was concerned about all the alcohol he'd had, so I asked if he thought it was a good idea for him to drive. He got really defensive and insisted he was fine. We left the bar, but then he walked off in the opposite direction. When I got home, I texted him just to make sure he was okay, given how much he'd been drinking. His reply? I only date girls I sleep with on the first date. Definitely dodged a bullet there. Story 15. A couple of months ago, I went on a Tinder date on a Sunday afternoon. I met up with the guy around 3 p.m., and he had great energy, funny and complimentary. The place we wanted to go had a long line, so we decided to head to another spot by the water for drinks and appetizers. He started drinking Mai Tais. He had 3, I had 1. They were pretty strong, and I was already tipsy after my first one. The bar had a 2 Mai Tai limit per person, but he managed to find another bartender to get a third. As the drinks kept flowing, he started joking about how much he loved me, but it quickly became more serious. By the time we were leaving, he even asked me to marry him. I laughed it off and suggested maybe we take things slow since we had just met. He got really upset and stormed off, leaving me standing on the street corner. Then, once he got home, it was only 5 p.m. He started texting me, asking me to come over and saying he missed me. He was 43. What the F? Story 16. I messaged a girl who was interested in meeting up, so I went to the coffee shop to meet her. But when I got there, she wasn't there. I asked what was going on, and she straight up admitted that she was actually a guy, catfishing me just to see me in person. He went on this long rant about how it was a shame I'm a lesbian because he'd totally be interested in hooking up with me. The creepiest part for me was that he didn't even try to get anything like nudes or anything I might understand. He just wanted to stare at me in public. It was honestly unsettling. Story 17. I've been waiting for the right moment to share this one. After a movie date with a guy I met on a dating app, we came back to my place. Let's call him Dude. I told him we could hang for a bit, but I had work the next morning, so I'd need to sleep soon. Dude said that was fine but mentioned he was hungry and was going to order some food. He ordered 2 large sandwiches and a milkshake. He finished it all, which seemed fine at first. He was tall, young, and still growing. I didn't think much of it. Afterward, we messed around for a bit and eventually fell asleep. A while later, I woke up to strange noises. My front door opening and closing repeatedly, and my dogs barking like crazy. It was 1 a.m., so I was confused. I walked out of my room to investigate and saw the bathroom light was on and the door was wide open. I walked toward it and found Dude, squatting over my toilet with a stick, poking around in some murky water that was about to overflow. He yelled, "Stop looking at me. Go back to bed. I've got it under control." I was too tired and confused to fully understand what was going on, so I nervously laughed. He then yelled, "Why don't you have a plunger?" I said, "I don't know, I never needed one." He insisted I go back to bed, saying he had it under control. I was too disturbed to process everything, and since I had to work in the morning, I went back to bed. A little later, I heard him peek into my room and say, "I fixed it," before hearing him leave and close the door behind him. The next morning, I cautiously checked the toilet. The water had gone down, but something was still sticking out. Upon closer inspection, I found the tip of a stick. After some effort, I managed to pull out a broken stick that was about 3 feet long, followed by several other fragments. I pieced together that Dude had kept going outside to find more sticks after each one broke. He'd left some stains from the water all over the floor. He also left in such a hurry that he forgot his inners, undershirt, and socks. After work, I went to the store and bought a plunger. Lesson learned. Story 18. This happened just after I decided to re-enter the dating scene following the end of a long-term relationship. It was around 12:45 a.m. when I received a message from a Tinder match asking what I was doing and inviting me to hang out. It seemed late, but I figured the clubs would still be open for a few more hours, so why not take the opportunity? After all, I was a single guy in his 20s for the first time. She said she'd pick me up, so I threw on some cologne and a nice shirt, ready to head out. When I got into the car, I was surprised to see her friend driving and my match sitting in the front passenger seat. It felt a little odd, but I figured it wasn't a big deal, and I asked which club we were heading to. "We're not really going out, just out," she replied. I felt a little uneasy, but went along with it, asking again where we were headed. She answered, "Just into town." They drove me to a car park under a bridge, and we parked. The driver cranked up the radio and they started chatting, but their conversation felt pretty dull, and they didn't really include me much. The driver pulled out a large bottle of chocolate milk and started drinking, while they casually rolled cigarette. After about 15 minutes, they got out of the car to smoke. I followed them, but realized this just wasn't my scene. My Tinder match was wearing fluffy white slippers that lit up with every step, and I decided to speak up. I appreciate you guys picking me up, but this really isn't my thing. I'm going to head out. Have a nice night, I said. They didn't take it well and seemed quite offended. Story 19. I have a story where I was probably the one who caused the nightmare. I went on a first date with a girl from Tinder at a Cajun restaurant in Dallas, Razoo's on 75. The night before, I had read about something called kratom, which was supposed to help you feel relaxed and euphoric. I had tried it the previous day by making tea with the recommended dosage, but didn't feel anything, so I figured I could try a little more to see if it would work. I thought, what better time to test it than on a first date? Since I didn't feel any effects the first time, I decided to take a larger amount. I wrapped a bunch of kratom, a bitter, green powder, in deli meatballs and swallowed them whole before heading to the restaurant. Everything felt fine until I sat down at the table and realized I was starting to feel really off. Suddenly, I knew I was about to get sick. I excused myself, stood up, and made it a few steps toward the bathroom before I started feeling worse. I quickly covered my mouth, but I couldn't hold it in. I ended up choking as I tried to get to the bathroom, leaving a trail of vomit behind me. Once I finally made it to the trash can, I started vomiting uncontrollably. After a while, I cleaned myself up, washing my face, arms, and hands, which were covered in vomit. I returned to the table, trying to salvage what was left of the date and my dignity. I felt so embarrassed and was really hoping she didn't think I was a total disaster. Definitely a lesson learned, and I still cringe thinking about it. Story 20. I matched with a girl on a dating app and we exchanged a lot of messages. Later that night, we had a phone conversation that went really well, so I asked her out the next day. She agreed, but then 5 minutes later, she told me there was something important she needed to share. She was permanently in a wheelchair. At that moment, I realized I was in a tricky situation. If I backed out, I'd be a jerk, but if I kept going, I could be leading her on. I decided to go ahead with the date and just treat it like any other. We talked more that night and then went to bed. The next morning, she called me early, saying she was doing something crazy but wouldn't tell me what it was. A few hours later, she called again, telling me she was going to send me a picture of what she did. I checked my messages and saw a picture of her wrist. She had tattooed my name on it. At that point, I was kind of taken aback, but I told my friends about it and went ahead with the date that evening. As I was driving to her place, I realized my car might not be able to accommodate her wheelchair, and I knew she drove, so I asked if she could drive us. She pulled up, and I got in, only to find out that she didn't have a handicapped-equipped car. Instead, she used 2 crutches to drive, one for the gas and one for the brake. I wasn't too comfortable with this, especially driving on the busy freeways, but I went along with it. We went out to eat, and during our meal, she got a call from her daughter. It turns out she had left her 10-year-old daughter home alone, and the kid was scared. I suggested we could go back, but she assured me everything was fine, saying she'd given her daughter something to help her sleep. We finished the meal, and I planned to take her to a movie afterward, but with everything going on with her daughter, we decided to head back. On the way back to her place, she suddenly said, "Wow, I'm kind of drunk." I was surprised since I knew she'd only had 1 drink, but when I asked if I could drive, she insisted on driving herself. She got into the fast lane and used her crutch to press the gas. At that point, I just kept hoping we'd make it back safely, but we did. When we got to her place, I wheeled her to her door, said goodbye, and made sure I made it out in one piece. The tattoo was real, though, and it was definitely a wild experience. Story 21. I had been talking to this guy for 2 weeks, and there were no red flags, so we decided to go out to dinner. I mentioned that I hadn't been going out much lately because I was saving up for a washer and dryer. Without missing a beat, he said, "Instead of saving for that, you should save for a boob job." I was completely caught off guard, and before I could respond, he added, "No, it's not a bad thing. My sister and mom both had small chest and got the job, and they look amazing." This was all before the waitress even brought our drink. I didn't know how to handle it, so I just got up and left. Story 22. I had been chatting with this girl for about 2 weeks, and everything seemed to be going well. Eventually, we exchanged numbers, and she started sending me nudes and being pretty flirtatious. After a stressful day at work, she convinced me to drive an hour to get coffee with her. However, once we met up, she spent the next hour and a half non-stop talking about her ex and how she had to see him at the bank. Whenever I tried to speak or change the subject, she immediately brought the conversation back to him. The next day, I received a text saying I was too boring to be more than just friends because I didn't talk enough. When I pointed out that she had dominated the conversation and wouldn't let me speak, she got upset and irate, even though we'd never had a boring conversation before meeting up. Story 23. This isn't my story, but I knew a guy who had a major slip of the tongue during a date, one of those moments where you just want to disappear. He told me about it after he got home, and all he could say was, "Why did I say that?" The date had been going fine, and they were walking back to a bus station when they passed a creepy alley. She made a comment like, "Wow, I wouldn't want to go down that alley," to which he awkwardly replied, "I imagine you're very vulnerable." Needless to say, she immediately left, and he was completely mortified. He was genuinely a good guy and had no idea why that came out of his mouth. He definitely wasn't a creepy person, and he was in no way trying to imply anything harmful. But, yeah, I can totally understand why she decided to run. Story 24. On our first date, we decided to go see a movie. She brought her sister along without asking me first, and somehow, I ended up paying for both of their tickets. I was a bit of a pushover back then. We watched Star Wars: The Force Awakens. It turns out, neither of them had ever seen a Star Wars movie and had no idea what was happening in the film. Not exactly the ideal situation. After the movie, the date ended at McDonald's, where she spent over an hour eating fries one at a time, while her sister went on a rant about people at her work. To this day, I'm still not sure what that date was supposed to be. There was definitely no second one. Story 25. I've only been on one Tinder date. We chatted for a while, and I agreed to pick her up at Starbucks. When I got there, she didn't look anything like her pictures, but I figured I'd be polite and hang out for a bit. We went to her place, and it smelled like a strong, overwhelming scent of cat pee, like it was everywhere. As if that wasn't strange enough, she then began showing me her large collection of animal tail butt plugs. At the same time, she yelled at her chihuahua and smacked it on the nose. Without missing a beat, she then asked if I wanted to make out on the couch. I awkwardly sat down, tried to look at my phone, and made up some story about my grandma being sick so I could leave as soon as possible. Story 26. I met this guy, and we had a pretty decent conversation. He was smart, funny, and we shared some nerdy hobbies. We decided to meet up at the local gamer bar, play some games, and have our first date. We sit down, and I realize, dude has no teeth. He explains that a dentist had told him they all needed to be removed, but he couldn't afford dentures, and he needed to wait for bone shards to fall out of his gums. As we're talking, he starts spitting all over our food. I understand it's something he can't help, but it made me uneasy. If he could hide something as big as this, what else might he be hiding? Plus, I couldn't get past the idea of making out with someone with no teeth, so I started feeling like maybe this wasn't the best match after all. Story 27. It wasn't Tinder, but Match.com. Back when it was still pretty new and online dating was kind of a weird concept. I matched with a girl and we decided to meet up. She was way out of my league, like way hotter than me, and the date was going incredibly well. We even kissed a bit. I couldn't believe my luck. We decided to keep the night going and went to a bar. Things were going well, and we found a cozy spot in the corner. But then, a group of black guys walked into the bar. I live in a very homogeneous country, so this was a bit out of the ordinary, especially back then. Suddenly, she got up, started yelling at them, saying they didn't belong there and dropping racial slurs. It felt like one of those horror movie moments where everything around you goes quiet and zooms out. I immediately got up and left. The next day, she called me to set up another date, but I ignored her. It was clear she was a lot more messed up than I could have imagined. Definitely too good to be true. Story 28. A few months ago, I went on a Tinder date that went really well. The girl was cute, had a stable job, and wasn't crazy, so we decided to go for a second date. The catch was, the second date was at her Thanksgiving party, where she wanted to introduce me to her friends and family. I thought it might have been a bit soon, but I didn't have anything planned that day, so I decided to go. My job at the party was to make the jungle juice, which was my usual go-to mix of Everclear, Hawaiian Punch, lemonade powder, and ice. It was a college classic, and got everyone pretty drunk. By the end of the party, my date and her friends were all praising me for the drink. She even mentioned that she really liked the fruit I added and that everyone at the party was trying to get some. For some reason, this didn't sit right with drunk me, so I went over to check out the alcohol canister. I grabbed a ladle and started scraping the bottom of the container, and that's when I found chunks of meat and pieces of ramen. I realized that someone had puked in the jungle juice. Edit. The recipe is simple. About 1/6 Everclear, 1/3 Hawaiian Punch, 1/2 Sprite, lots of ice, and at least 2 pink lemonade powders. Everclear and lemonade powder go in first. Mix everything up, add ice, then slowly pour in the Hawaiian punch until the alcohol taste is balanced. Top it off with Sprite to make it a little bubbly, and you've got the sweetest, most alcoholic drink ever. Story 29. I met this really cute girl on Tinder, and we got along pretty well. I don't remember exactly how our first date went, but after hanging out a few times, I went over to her place and we hooked up. It was great, except for one thing. I had forgotten she was fluent in German, which was in her bio. So, in the middle of everything, this cute blonde starts shouting in German. No offense to the Germans, but it wasn't exactly the sexiest language in that moment. It was totally unexpected, and I was a little terrified. Another time, we went to a bar to grab a drink, and it was obvious she knew the bartender. We were chatting, and she was hanging all over me, a little PDA happening. After the bartender left, I asked how she knew him, and she casually mentioned he was her ex-husband. I was a bit taken aback, because we were all in our 20s. When she went to the bathroom, the bartender leaned over and asked how I liked the German in bed. Still a little shocked, I muttered, "It's all right," and he winked at me. When she came back, everything was normal, but it was a weird situation. Nice guy, weird girl. The bartender even comped our drinks, and he still remembers me when I go in for a beer. Story 30. I have a couple of stories, though not from Tinder. These were from when I was using Match back when I was single and ready to mingle. The first guy seemed nice at first, but he was a bit controlling on our first date, picking the venue without asking my opinion. I thought maybe he just misunderstood what I liked, so I agreed to a second date. However, this time, he wouldn't tell me where we were going other than London. I told him I needed to know the location, not only to figure out what to wear but also for personal safety reasons. He insisted I wear a dress, which I never wear. When I told him I wouldn't, he got upset. I pressed him for more details, and he called me difficult and unreasonable. He then lost his temper, calling me insulting names, so I blocked him. The second guy was just plain rude. He made several odd comments throughout the evening. When I joked about having a bigger behind, I was very honest in my profile about being a size 14 to 16 UK. He said in a very deadpan tone, "Yes, I noticed." He chewed gum throughout the date, and when we ate, he stuck his gum to the side of the plate and left it there for the waitress to clear. Later, we ran into one of my colleagues who had a bit too much to drink. I introduced them, and my colleague drunkenly said, "Fabergé is the best boss ever." "I'm really not." And the guy literally shrugged and turned his back on him. I ended the date early, and as I turned to leave, he tried to aggressively shoulder bump me and missed. I blocked him immediately and reported him to Matt. Story 31. This one's a bit of a wild ride, but here it goes. I went on a date with an Australian woman who had just moved here a couple of weeks ago, so she didn't know anyone. The first date went fine, we went to a pub, and although she talked nonstop and was a bit intense, we got along well. On the second date, she chose a very budget-friendly pub because she had just started a new job and hadn't been paid yet. Afterward, she wanted to check out some live music, so I took her to a cool venue about 30 minutes away. The band was great, but she ended up annoying everyone there with her chatter. One of the band members' girlfriends even asked me, "Are you seeing the red flags yet?" To get away from the situation, I suggested we head back to our area. On the way back, she insisted we go to a popular Aussie/Kiwi hangout bar/club for drink. We arrived, but it was closed. Some people outside invited us to join them, but I managed to talk her out of it. She then decided she needed to use the bathroom, so I stood in front of her to give her some privacy while she went. During this time, I heard a strange splat and she said, "Did I just poop?" "Nah, I don't think so." I turned around and saw a huge, bizarrely colored splat of diarrhea on the ground behind her. She seemed unfazed and said, "Oh wait, I've got some plastic wrap from the CD I bought earlier," and started wiping herself with that. At this point, I quickly offered to call her a cab, but she declined and insisted we find those people to go drinking again. I politely refused, and she kissed me and walked off. What's odd is that if she had gone back to those people, they would have probably been in for an unpleasant surprise if things had gotten physical. Story 32. I had my first and only Tinder date with a guy I'll call Greg. We hit it off really well, and after talking for about 2 weeks we decided to meet. Greg lived about an hour away, and during our chats, he often bragged about his food knowledge, since I work in the fine dining industry. He'd tell me about the meals he was cooking for himself and his roommates, trying to impress me. After some time, he invited me over to his house to cook for me. I figured, why not? We had talked for a while, and I felt comfortable with the situation. The day of the date, we met somewhere neutral, and I followed Greg to his house. He kept talking about how excited he was to cook for me. When we arrived, everything seemed great. He was exactly as I had imagined, and we got along well. Dinner time rolled around, and Greg told me he needed to go downstairs to begin prep. I offered to help, but he insisted I relax on the couch. We continued chatting from opposite rooms, and I couldn't see what was going on in the kitchen. He mentioned that dinner would be ready soon and that he had made extra in case I was hungry. 15 minutes later, Greg jumped up to a timer and rushed to the kitchen. He came back with sauces, ketchup, ranch, and barbecue, and told me these were the best part of the meal. I was a little confused, wondering what he had made, as he refused to tell me, wanting to keep it a surprise. He went back to the kitchen and returned with a turkey platter. I was expecting something impressive, but what he proudly placed on the table were several bags of frozen fries. Greg eagerly awaited my reaction, clearly hoping I would be amazed. I couldn't help but laugh. His smile faded as I thanked him and told him the fries were great. I thought maybe it was a joke, but nope, Greg had invited me over to cook his specialty, frozen French fries. To be fair, they were delicious, and the sauces were the best part. Story 33. On my way to what would turn out to be the worst date ever, I received a text from the guy, letting me know he'd already ordered for me at the burrito place. And what did he order? A salad. At a burrito place. I was confused. Was I stuck in the past? Was I no longer capable of ordering my own food? When I arrived, my salad was ready, sitting next to his plate of tacos. For the next half hour, he proceeded to talk about his ex-girlfriend, who apparently was a model, and how passionate their breakup bang had been just last weekend. The final straw came when, after I told him I wasn't a fan of smoking, he went ahead and asked a stranger for cigarettes, then chain-smoked them beside me. Story 34. I met this guy on Tinder, and we had a couple of really fun dates. I was pretty into him, so on our third date I decided I wanted to take things further. He took me out for a lovely dinner and then invited me back to his place for a glass of wine. One thing led to another, and we started making out on his couch, fully clothed. But the make-out session went on forever, and I was getting a little frustrated, ready to move things along. So, I took the initiative. He sat up, still fully dressed, looked at me and said, "I can't do it with you, I have an STD." It was possibly the most awkward moment of my life. I tried to be as gracious as possible, but I quickly got dressed and left. As my friends pointed out, I'm really grateful he was honest with me. Story 35. We talked for a couple of hours, drank some wine, watched a movie, and then did it. Afterward, things took an unexpected turn. We were lying in bed when she suddenly looked like she was about to pass out. I helped her sit up and asked if I could get her some water or anything, but she didn't say a word. She just sat there, holding her hair, for a few minutes before vomiting all over my sheet. At that point, I just wanted to get her into the shower as quickly as possible, but she seemed too stunned to move. I didn't know what to do. After a couple of minutes, I finally convinced her to get up, and we made our way to the shower so she could clean up while I dealt with the sheet. I checked on her every 5 minutes, but she would just sit there on the floor with the shower running, not saying anything. It felt really awkward. After about 20 minutes, I brought her a towel and some clothes, and we sat on the edge of my bed. That's when she told me she was born without a womb. She started crying, so I tried to comfort her, and we eventually went to sleep, without sheets, since I didn't have spare ones in my student apartment. The next morning, I made breakfast, and she went home. It was definitely the weirdest date I've ever had. Story 36. I had just gotten out of a breakup on campus when I matched with a really attractive girl who was sending me pretty explicit messages. I was feeling vulnerable, so I didn't question much, and a few days later, I headed over to her place. She gave me a specific time to come over, and while it was a bit odd, I didn't think much of it. It was the middle of the day on a busy college campus, so how bad could it be? About half an hour after I arrived, her husband walked in. Turns out, I was just a pawn in a revenge plot. Needless to say, no more Tinder for me. So yeah, I basically froze when he started yelling at her in a language I didn't understand. She got up and started yelling back. The apartment was a student building off campus, so I thought she just had a roommate who wasn't home. Lesson learned. Never assume. I just grabbed my stuff as fast as I could and ran out of there. Looking back, I think it might have been intentional, but maybe I was just unlucky. Either way, it's better to strike up a conversation with the cute girl at the coffee shop than rely on dating apps. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.